You're up, Marge.
Okay, I'm up. Hi, everyone. I'm Marge LaFawn, Program Assistant at Rehoboth Beach Museum. And I'm so happy to welcome you all here to our online program series, Conversations on History. Before we get started, I want to go over a few best practices for the virtual program for those who might not be familiar with Zoom. We will be keeping everyone muted during the discussion. It just makes for a better presentation without distracting noises in the background. In the upper right-hand corner, if you select speaker view, you will see the presenters on full screen. That's entirely up to you. And during the presentation, you can make comments or ask questions using the chat feature of Zoom. You'll find that icon down at the very bottom of your screen. It looks like a little talk icon.
A thought bubble.
Thank you. I couldn't think of the word, Faye. I knew I'd get help on that one. Okay. For today's program, we've invited James Sears and Fay Jacobs in a little different format. Dr. James T. Sears is an American educator, historian, and activist. He is a former professor at the University of South Carolina and has written several books about the LBGT history. He is currently working on a cultural history of Rehoboth Beach. Faye Jacobs has had a long career as a journalist, author of 5 books, and worked in theater, and she was a driving force behind Main Street in Rehoboth Beach in the 80s. She's worked with Camp Rehoboth for, I didn't even know it was 26 years, Faye, until we were just talking. And she's currently editor of Letters from Camp. And if that isn't enough to keep her busy, she currently has a one-woman show, Aging Gracelessly, 50 Shades of Fun.
Before COVID. COVID shut me down.
Well, we're going to get it back. We're going to get it.
Yeah.
So Faye and James will discuss his upcoming book and what they both feel is unique about Rehoboth Beach and its progression to a more diverse community. That is the essence of Room Enough for All. We will do a question and answer at the end of today's program. Faye and James, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
I'm going to sort of turn it up to you, Faye, to start a little bit. And,
okay.
Let's go.
All right, James, hello.
Hey.
Hello, we got the two of us here, and we're really enmeshed in the history of gay Rehoboth or LGBTQ Rehoboth. And I'm very excited that you're writing a book about it and interviewing us all. It's a great topic. I've been consumed with this community here in Rehoboth for 26 years. And I have seen such growth and such diversity and such opening of hearts in that time. And I'm just thrilled that you're all going to get it down on paper, and it's going to be a wonderful reference. So tell me about the book, James. Let's start with the book.
Well, let me first say that I want to thank you and other people like yourself, including Libby Stiff and Rich Barnett and others who over the years have done, I think, a really outstanding job of chronicling different parts of the LGBTQ community in Rehoboth Beach area. And in fact, it's because of those writings that I became interested in Rehoboth, because if you think about all the books that have been written, I mean, there are obviously lots of books have been written from San Francisco to Detroit, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and even, you know, books and articles on P-Town, for example, on Key West, Fire Island, classic book. Nothing was written about Rehoboth. And so when my husband and I came here a couple of years ago and I started reading these wonderful articles, it just struck me, well, 2 questions. One, why had no one written a book about this? And more importantly is, how did Rehoboth go from basically a small, sleepy, although it was slightly north of the Mason-Dixon line, I'll still say southern town, to a town that really was much more inclusive, that lived up to his name of Rehoboth. And in the process of asking that question, That's how I started talking with people. And then it seemed to be that the logical thing to do would be to begin oral history. And the reason I use oral histories, and I do that in all the books I've written, is because I think it's really important to hear from the voices of the people who were here at the time. And the voices are not necessarily in unison. People disagree, and that's fine. And so the oral histories that I'm writing is based on these interviews. And I have been very fortunate in being able to get the support of the museum and Nancy Alexander, and which, by the way, will have the complete set of the interviews and the transcripts when the project's done, as well as Duke University. And also the support of the library, who's allowed me to come in during the times when they were closed to actually go through every page of Whale. So I probably know more about Rehoboth than I want to know. And that whole process then leads me to that question is, what was it about Rehoboth that it transformed itself? And not only it transformed itself, but many of the people themselves were transformed in the process. And and the last point I just want to make here is some people may be bothered by the term queering Rehoboth. And that's why I like the word like camp. When Murray Archibald came up with the word camp, he used it in a way that had multiple meanings, and he used it purposely. Same thing for the queering Rehoboth. Queering Rehoboth means to see Rehoboth in a different light. It also obviously takes a word which is an anathema to many people, including myself growing up in the 60s, and uses it in an empowering way. So let me stop there and let me ask you a question, Faye.
Sure.
And that is one of the things that, I mean, when you were here and you came here on a sailboat with your longtime wife and partner, but one of the two people that you met and you became very good friends with were Anya and Muriel. And I think they're part of this hidden history. And you and I were just talking that if you look at the gay books that have been written from John D'Amelia onwards, Naive Press, and particularly these two women are barely mentioned. And I'd like to ask you about, if you could just tell us a little bit about them or your insights about, because they lived here in the early 1970s. And
60s and 70s. Yeah, well, Rehoboth has been queer since the 20s and 30s. People like Louisa Carpenter, whose big mansion was just torn down on the beach, has been here. And the closeness to Washington, D.C. also had people coming here in the 40s and the 50s who worked in the government, who may have been gay, and they could only see their friends here because they would be in danger of being fired if they had a gay life in DC. So all of those things happened. And then in the late 60s, Anita Marchant and Muriel Crawford came here and tried to buy a house on Laurel Street. And since they had no men involved in the transaction, no bank would give them a mortgage. And the mayor had to interfere with the process and go to county bank and say, you have to give these two women a mortgage. And they were just horrified that there was no man involved. So the two women, they had a beautiful house on Laurel Street, and they were here, and they were two of the four principals of Naiad Press, which was the very first lesbian press and most successful lesbian press in the United States. And Anita was the only reason she started the press is she was an author and no one would publish her books. And they wouldn't touch it with a stick, even in the 70s. And so it was 1973 that she began with her partners, Naiad Press, and ran the whole thing from their house here in Rehoboth Beach, along with their winter place in Florida. And so they were a lovely couple. They met in 1948, which is remarkable. They were together a total of 57 years. They lived here until they both passed away in 2005, I believe, possibly 2006. And they died within 4 months of each other. They were both in their 90s, and Rehoboth was their hometown. And as celebrities here, they held a salon at their house on Laurel Street every Saturday night at 6 o'clock, maybe 5 o'clock. And people from all over the community came. The politicians, the ministers, the rabbi, so many different people, musicians, actors, a lot of young gay men who were visiting here heard about them, and people introduced them. I was introduced to them by Murray and Steve from Camp Rehoboth. And every Saturday night, there were at least 20 people on their porch of an amazing, diverse community that came to have a scotch with Muriel and Anita, and they became part of the folklore here.
It almost sounds to me like the salons that were going on in Paris back in the 1920s and early 1930s.
Believe me, that is exactly what Anita wanted it to be.
Okay.
And we surely talked about every topic from literature to music to local politics. The mayors have been known to stop by their house, and it was just quite a wonderful thing. And their passing was a bit of history gone. There was a thing at the museum. They did historic women of Rehoboth Beach, and they included Muriel and Anita, and their little scotch glasses, their crystal scotch glasses, were part of the exhibit, because what I said was they liked publishing, they loved publishing, they loved each other, and they loved scotch, not necessarily in that order.
And that's one of the things that is fascinating to me as a interloper, shall we say, into Rehoboth Beach, and that is that there were, even in the height of the division, and I like to look at the two bookends of the two Washington Post magazine articles, one in 1989 and one in 1999. 1989 had, the title was Battle of Rehoboth, and 1999 had more of an inclusive theme. Is that during that 10-year period, a lot of things changed, but also there's a lot of division. But the division was simply not between, quote unquote, the gay and straight communities. It was, across the board. I mean, there were groups who had different alliances for different reasons. And one of the aspects, going back to the couple on Laurel Street, is that they really represented, in some ways, old, quote unquote, old gay Rehoboth. Okay.
They did. But for many years when they were here, they were not out, and it was really a hidden relationship in this town. They fought to join the country club, they did not want them at the country club, but one of them, Anita being a lawyer, made sure that the country club accepted them. And they weren't really out until 1993. And someone outed them, and they were horrified and afraid to go to church the next Sunday. But the town embraced them completely. So they really were sort of separate from the long-term historical part of Rehoboth as a gay community.
But again, to me, that sort of reflects a little bit of what that part of, quote, old gay Rehoboth was. That is, people were with small groups of people, they were friends, they had dinner parties, they would go to the beach, et cetera, but no one felt comfortable, nor did they want to be out.
That is correct.
Yeah, in fact, the first thing I saw on the couple was when Lambda Rising opened their bookstore at the same year that Camp opened the Courtyard.
Right.
Is that they were the couple that actually were the grand, I don't know if you want to say marshals or mistresses, whatever the right phrase is.
Right.
Because they were there in the point of honor, which I thought was really, really, really important and really telling.
Absolutely. One of the first times I met Anita was when she was doing a reading at Lambda Rising, which was very interesting. It was very interesting. And so basically, they were here, and a lot of the other people started to arrive. The history itself, I think, can be dated from 1979-80, with the opening of some of our wonderful gourmet restaurants and the bars, the Renegade, and later the Strand. And I know you have a lot to say about that, James, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, no, I mean, you've been saddled with the awesome responsibility of editing for a while. Again, the letters, and of course, being an old professor, you know, I can never give you 800 words. So,
Right.
So the next issue is actually going to focus on the beginning of that. But let's have a little bit of disagreement here. Is that, you know, I would go back, well, to two things. One is I think that when the Whale started, I think in '76 or so, there's a two-part series that Trish did, who at that time I think was the news editor for the Whale, in 1978, and it was a two-part series on homosexuality in Rehoboth. And I think that was, at least for as I can see, the really first time that this topic, quote, topic was broached. Before that, there were articles occasionally in the state paper, other places, about homosexuals being arrested. And in fact, the classic example, I think you knew him, was a guy by the name of Jimmy Short.
Oh,
Jimmy
yes.
Short was a Lewis boy. He was caught up, which many gay men were, in a raid in 1962. He had the infamous case of being the last case in Delaware for a person to be prosecuted under the sodomy statute.
That's right. That's right.
Then he later came and bartended at some of the.
Well, he had to, you know, because he lost his teaching license because he was arrested. And this was in Wilmington. And Jimmy came down here and he became a bartender at the Nomad, which the Nomad and the Boathouse were both early gay bars as well. And they were here, I guess they were here in the late 70s, the mid 70s. And even earlier than that, in 59, 60 through 62, you had the Pink Pony on the Boardwalk. And that wasn't a gay bar. But at 5 o'clock, cocktail hour, sometimes some men would go. And the interesting thing was that the liquor laws did not allow you to walk around with a drink in your hand. Like Aqua today, you could not walk around and have a bunch of people all conversing. You had to sit in a seat, and if you got up, you had to leave your cocktail, or the waiter would carry it with you to another table. So it was very hard to meet people. But the Pink Pony was the only place that people went at that time, but it was washed out to sea in the 1962 storm.
Well, let me ask you this, because I heard that there was also for a short time a bar called the Shaker on First and Rehoboth.
Now, I don't know anything about that. That's before me.
Okay. Also, I heard that at certain times, the old Dinner Bell had a pretty strong gay clientele.
Absolutely.
Later on in the early 70s,
yes,
the top of the Henlopen Hotel, which actually reminded me a lot, again, of the South, because if you were a gay person, particularly a gay man, and you in the 60s and even 70s, you wanted to find other gay people, one of the places you'd go to, particularly in the South, was the nicest hotel in town.
Right, and the Henlopen was that. Yeah, the Henlopen was that. And the Dinner Bell was interesting. Anita and Muriel used to go there quite often early in the day and for breakfast. And they would see the fishermen coming in for an early breakfast before they went out. And they said, you know, so there were fishermen, there were older Southern ladies, there were lesbians, there were so many different people, and the Dinner Bell catered to them all. And it was pretty interesting. It was a good group of people.
You mentioned the Strand, and you didn't mention the Renegade, but I'll mention the Renegade, or you may have mentioned, I don't remember, I'm getting old. But I mentioned to you and also to Marge that I came up through a donation because I'm still looking for people to talk to, particularly people who were around in the 70s and before. But this is a videotape that was given to me that was done in 1992 I'll just play like 60 seconds of it, and it sort of takes us back to the Strand Renegade, you know, and what was going on there. This was actually developed through the under the auspices of part of the economic outreach that Camp and other people were doing to help promote, to bring more gay people here in Rehoboth.
Well, absolutely, and that's what people are saying here. Is it started with the Nomad and the Boathouse, and then the Renegade opened, and then the Strand came after that. So. You know, this is the time to talk about that. And in this coming issue of Letters, the story will be in there as well.
Okay, let me just play this 60 seconds and then just for people's amusement, I can here. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, again, the quality leaves a lot to be desired. Okay.
Okay.
There, under one roof, you'll find a wide assortment of dining pleasures. The Surfside Diner offers such dishes as Mom's Meatloaf. But if your mood is more geared for playing a game of pool, perhaps Rehoboth's best bistro, the Westside Cafe, is in order. The menu offers entrees ranging from chicken to pizza. For dancing, there are 2 clubs where you can pick up the hottest group at either the Strand or Renegade. The Strand is located directly above these 2 restaurants. The Renegade Restaurant and Lounge is a gay mega complex which provides not only dining but dancing as well. On Saturdays, the Renegade also has a ladies' tea dance.
So that's my contribution here. Let me just make sure.
Memories.
Oh shit. Okay. Okay. No, that's okay. I thought I lost the screen.
You're here. You're still here.
One of the things I'd be interested in your thoughts, Faye, is, and I know that you were here in the 90s, is that as was told to me, I mean, in the early, like in many gay and lesbian communities, the 2 women and men groups were separate for lots of economic reasons, political reasons, etc. But at a certain point in Rehoboth, they began to come together. Now the women's tea dance, and also there was a similar thing, I think, in either the Boathouse or the Nomad, maybe the Nomad.
Nomad became filled with women in the early 90s.
Okay, and of course then you had people like Paige, who married, but I forget her maiden name, but it was Paige Bedini. But you had lots of these groups that would be separate, but at a certain point in time, women and men, lesbians and gay men came together. And I guess
that was the AIDS crisis. That was the AIDS crisis, James. That was when the women's community pitched in and helped the guys, and all of a sudden that we found out we had an awful lot in common, and it truly became the gay community. It wasn't just the gay boys and the lesbians anymore. It became one community. And I think that's an important milestone. Sadly, it happened in a really sad way, but that's an important milestone.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, Bibi, I forget her, Bobo, I don't know if it's Bibi, I think of Bibi Rebozo. No,
right.
But Bobo, who was manager of the Lambda Rising, she was as far as I know, first openly gay or lesbian person to even run for commissioner. And that was, I think, in 1992 or something like that, 3 or something like that.
So let's see, hi. I've lost James. All right, there we go. No, I've lost James.
Oh, you can't have lost James. James?
Am I here?
Yeah, he's here. I just couldn't see him anymore on my screen.
Okay.
Maybe this is a good point for Marge to take over here in terms of how you want to deal with these chat comments.
Well, that's what I was
There's a lot of wonderful comments.
We're getting a lot of good comments. And how about if we open up the chat and maybe, let me bring the chat up. We have Frank Cooper, who has quite a few comments. We have Michael. Frank, would you like to start if you unmute yourself?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I've been coming to Rehoboth since I was literally a child crawling on the ground, and my earliest gay experiences were in Rehoboth. Then there was a period of absence when I kind of came out and started going to bars, and then some friends of mine in Ocean City said, "Oh, there's a great bar in Rehoboth Beach." And I said, "Well, I'm in Rehoboth. I'd love it. Let's go." And it was a boathouse. And that was in the late 70s. And that's when I kind of came back to Rehoboth as a different person, as an out person. And the boathouse has just incredible memories for me. And that's what I named my house. I live in Rehoboth Beach, and my house is called the Boathouse.
Well, you know, the point about the boathouse was that the water came in every night.
Oh,
And they'd
yeah.
have to sweep it back out so they could open.
Well,
Because
they
it was so
opened that
close.
garage door. It was
Right.
a boat repair shop at one time.
Right.
And that was the dance floor. And we used to be drunk and doing poppers, and we would splash into the water. You know, we just go out into the water. It was chaos, but it was really fun. It was
Right.
a one of a kind place for sure.
Right, and my friends Anita and Muriel, they were in their 70s and 80s by that time, would go down to the boathouse, and they said they were going just to play snooker, which I guess is pool.
Yeah.
I understand that the owners of the boathouse, the couple Sid and June, they actually got, the way that started was that they actually allied with a guy that also owned a gay bar up in Wilmington. His guy's name is Francis Murray. He owned the gas lamp.
Yeah.
And then eventually, but it became a very extremely popular place. But also, I think that Sid was a dentist too, wasn't he? Or produced dental.
I think so. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I used to know, but I can't remember.
Yeah. The reason I remember that is because in my foray through every article in the Whale, there was an article about him that apparently got arrested because he was selling some of the dentures without a license.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, the other story about the boathouse is that they used to have bouncers who were members of the Washington Redskins. And I don't remember how that happened, but they used to have guys coming in from DC. I'm looking at a comment now. A lot of the people on the Zoom, James, probably have some fabulous stories.
Yeah.
And I would love to.
I have to say, I heard the story about the Redskins because we came from DC, and we knew about the Redskins coming in. Of course, my husband and I used to go down to the boathouse occasionally too. We had a carry out across the street from the Bottle and Cork, so sometimes at night when we'd leave and want to just blow off straight steam, we would go there. Bob DeMaria, would you like to unmute yourself?
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
we can hear
Hello.
you. Yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon. I started coming to Rehoboth in 1969. I was in the Army from 66 to 68, and then stayed in Washington, and a friend invited me to his place on a third floor walk up on Olive Street. And that's the first place I went to was the Pink Pony. And it was, as you said, it was not what I expected, but there were nice people there. And eventually, in about 1971 or so, I got into a group house that became eventually the former La La Land, those two homes. My group was in one home and another group was in the other home, and the owners of the place, Don Mitchell and Carl Seldom-Ridge, had this little Japanese style house in the back. And we were there for many, many years. There was an old couple across the street, husband and wife. They would sit on their rocking chair, and we would have people over, as most people did in the early 70s. And one day, myself and one of the guys went over to say hello and just apologize if we were making too much noise and were preventing them from getting sleep. And they said, young man, we were going to move about a couple of years ago, but ever since you boys moved in, you give us a show every Friday and Saturday night, and just please don't do anything but keep it up. And we had such a good time. We'd have parties. We had so many people on the front porch, it collapsed. And it was only about 3 feet off the ground. We had a couple of stairs, but we stayed there, and there was the Nomad, there was the Boathouse. Does anyone remember the opening of what was supposed to be a bathhouse on First and I think Philadelphia or a street there? I don't think it lasted a weekend. And before we got a chance to go there, it was closed. I don't know if anybody remembers that, and I'm trying to remember the name, but it's escaping me.
I think it was called the Sandcastle.
The Sandcastle. I was getting Ice Palace, Crystal Palace, and all of them. But you're right, the Sandcastle. It was the Sandcastle. And it's just been one, we finally bought a home in my family, of which Mayor Jeffrey Slavin, who's on this, of Somerset, we bought a home at Scarborough and Laurel, 311 Scarborough, and I think it was 92. And it's just been 50 years of just magic. I had to move to Pittsburgh for 1 year for a job, but I would come back every 2 weeks. I spent more time on the road than I did in Rehoboth, but I had to get back to Rehoboth. You have to get back to the water. And it was because of volleyball. There was, I don't know if anybody remembers Bob Carter and Lenny Haft and Bob Gray of Hill and Milton, Bob Alfondri and Carol Sledge, of course. Well, Bob Carter was he kept the volleyball net, and he would come down from the Dewey side because they lived on Cullen Street in Rehoboth by the Sea. And, Bob Carter was a big Republican lobbyist.
So was Bob Gray.
Right, and Bob Gray. Lenny Haft, his father started Dot Drug.
Yes, and I worked for them, and I knew him.
Well, Lenny was an architect, so he didn't participate in the business, but he said, but when we had a family meeting, the first thing I would ask is, am I a member of this family? Because we're going to discuss the distribution of profits. And he had this little red Mercedes SL, and he wore capes. He was the flamboyant one. Bob was the more feet on the ground, and he turned the volleyball net when he got tired of carrying it down. He gave it to me and Bob Bruce. Bob Bruce, who was no longer with us, was a 6'8" Texan from Amarillo, and it was fun. But we would have to walk past the beach, past the DuPont house, the Carpenter house. I guess there were 2 DuPont houses. They were all DuPont houses, right? But we would walk past the Carpenter house to set up the net so that nobody would bother us. And eventually, some people, do you recall, just got tired of walking all that way and plopped down where we plop down now. And that was it, Poodle, and we didn't have to walk that far anymore, so it was great. And that net has been passed to icons down there. You remember Forrest and who
Absolutely.
And Mark, etc. And I think one of my great disappointments personally was that when they started drag volleyball, I just couldn't do it. I was just too shy, and it was such fun. But and I think this is the first time we missed it this year because
this is the first time, and it was supposed to be the finale.
Yes,
but they have said they will do it next year.
Good. I'm glad to hear
the 30th year for drag volleyball.
I'm glad
Interesting.
to hear that.
I'm going to interrupt you, Bob, for a few minutes to
That's fine.
see if Mayor Jeffrey Slavin will unmute himself. And I have to say that he says, Bob, you've been here for 100 years or more. I know how much you appreciate that. But Jeffrey, you were campaign manager for Mark Aguirre?
Yes, I was the campaign manager for Mark. He was the first LGBT person elected to the commission. He wasn't the first one to run, as was mentioned before. I think he might have been the, Faye, you would know this. Wasn't he like the second or the third?
I think so. I think he was the second, but he was the first that was elected.
He
Who
was the first
out.
elected.
The first out gay person who was elected. We don't know.
There might have been some closet cases.
That's what I think, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. And another great story, of course, which we all remember is, which I think has been referenced, is about the Strand and all the tensions. And I think that Professor Sears has done a lot of research, because that made the papers in
Yes.
the
in
district
Washington.
and in Wilmington. And that's when that whole,
Right.
I mean, that was probably the saddest time, when
Yes.
those right-wingers were promoting that ridiculous make Rehoboth a family.
Rehoboth a family town.
Yeah, I mean, that
Yeah.
was really the low point. And I think that we've come a long, long way today.
And I think the story of the Strand will be written beautifully by James, because he's done all the research. And he was talking about factions, and it really was the renegade people versus the Strand people. And
another whole thing is the history of the Rehoboth Beach Homeowners Association, which were very anti-gay, and now it's interesting how the gay community of today is on both sides of that.
Yes. But I have to credit Steve Elkins here. First of all, I'm pretty sure his doing turned the homeowner association around. He was instrumental in that, without question. And he also was one person who was arrested in the Strand scuffle. And that's another story, James, that, and I'll never forget that picture in the paper with Steve being arrested and his picture in the Blade. And it was quite a time, but it all worked out well.
Yes, and Stephen Murray were the real,
heroes.
They were they will go down in history as the Frank Kameny of Rehoboth.
That's right.
Of course, you can't discount the contribution that the Blue Moon made to all this. I was one of the investors in the Strand. I can tell all those stories, but the Blue Moon is really, Joyce and Victor. They put Rehoboth
on the map.
I know all these other establishments were great, but they were more like quiet and on the down low. But the Blue Moon is when Rehoboth really started to attract. He was the anchor of Baltimore Avenue that made it what it is today. So
yes, absolutely.
I don't remember exactly the date of this, but around the time the Blue Moon was, Victor and Joyce were considering going to Baltimore Avenue, there was a saloon there called Doc John's Saloon. It was like a seedy place, but there was an article in one of the papers saying that the Vice Squad actually was there because they ended up arresting one of the barmaids because she was luring people, she was inviting people upstairs for a price to engage in sexual activity. Okay, so, from that perspective, the avenue has changed a lot. But actually, when I was talking to Victor, he was telling me that he had first tried to get Keith and Libby to move the back porch to Baltimore Avenue. And they didn't want anything to do with it, particularly Keith, because of it being so far out of the way. Now, it's hard for us to imagine a block away being so far out of the way. But again, that's sort of the perspective that people had back then, which I think is interesting.
Faye, can I ask you a question? How much of an effect do you think the Main Street campaign had on bringing people together. I mean, I know Steve and Murray are the great, you know,
Right.
but
Well, Main Street started about 1997. And when I came in 99 as the executive director, it was the first time that the organization partnered with other groups. And I made sure we partnered with Camp Rehoboth. And so many more people got to see and work with the volunteers from Camp Rehoboth. And Murray and Steve certainly laid the path for it. But from 99 to 2009, when I was there, we really made sure that Camp Rehoboth and the gay community were a huge number of our volunteers. And also my second in command there was a lesbian. And, you know, so we really integrated with camp, with the museum, with the historical society, with the library, and did those things.
And that is why Faye is one of the historic figures of modern day gay Rehoboth.
right.
Thank you, Mayor.
I know she's modest, but you can't imagine how impactful her writings have been, her communication.
Oh, yeah.
It's incredible.
Thank you.
Um,
Well, it's been fun.
I just wanted to say two things real quickly. Well, first, we're all glad that they came here on the sailboat and stayed.
Yes. It was a power boat. I'm sorry. It was a power boat.
Okay, well, that's why you get a chance to read over what I write before it gets
Right.
published. But the other thing is, Steve was actually, before the Main Street even started, there was a planning committee because it was part of a national group, the Main Street, and Steve was actually part of that planning group.
Right.
Okay, he was not part of the board, so he was out there at the ground floor, which goes back to what Mayor Jeff said in terms of Steve's role here with respect to always trying to be involved. How can I be of help? Not what can you do for me, but how can we help you?
The outreach was unbelievable. The outreach was unbelievable. And
He was a visionary. He was a visionary. He reached out to the political structure, not only our allies, but our enemies.
That's exactly right. And he turned our enemies into our allies.
Yes,
And
he did.
it was quite remarkable. And that is why we're talking today about
That's right.
the queering of Rehoboth is really the growth of Rehoboth, is really the putting Rehoboth on the map for everyone. And that is due, I think, remarkably to Steve and Murray and what they have done here.
And
And
I
you,
would like to, just as a historical context here, since this is being recorded, make two historical things. One is before camp and before that was going on, you had two activists, Evo Dominicus and Jim Welsh, who were based in Wilmington, and they were activists throughout the 80s. In fact, Jim was involved in the ACLU, is also involved in healthcare crisis, the AIDS, etc. And Evo then was invited to be part of the original board of camp. Okay, so it wasn't that, I mean, but certainly in terms of gay organizations, camp was the first really gay organization. But the reason for mentioning that also is that everything has a context. Okay, and so Stephen Murray just didn't come out of the ground de novo. And as Stephen Murray tried to do what they did, in my opinion, in 1980, what they did in 1990, they wouldn't have been at all successful. And people like not only Stephen Murray, but many other people, like we mentioned, like Berdini, who was also on the board, Bobo, who was also on the board, Moss.
What's her name? Bobo Jansen?
Yeah, Bobo Jansen.
Jansen.
Elizabeth Moss, who served as the bookkeeper, who did all
Natalie Moss.
All the work that had to be done to put together the 501c3 and all that.
Yes.
These are people that and also Jim Barr. Jim Barr was the first editor,
first
executive director, first editor of letters for 2 years, the first executive director. So, Steve and Murray, I think, are critical to understand, in my opinion, and I'm saying this because I like to get people's reaction, critical to understanding how Rehoboth changed in a positive way. But they didn't come out, there's a context, there's a lot of other people that were involved in that, some of whom I mentioned.
Totally. and they were straight. But another thing to point out is before this, just like in a lot of cities where gay people gentrified neighborhoods, basically that's what our people did. And I think Faye would agree with me. And then a whole new crowd of straight people came and wanted to join in it all because they weren't comfortable when it was a sleepy, segregated, racist town. But they were comfortable after the gays came and gentrified the place to a certain extent. And then now it's a huge draw. The property values have, quadrupled or more. And I think that Steve and Murray and Faye and Natalie and all that crowd that was involved with Camp Rehoboth were a major historic part of that.
There's a line in John Berendt's book about Savannah, the Garden of Good and Evil. And he said the town really started to work when the bachelors came to town. And that's how they referred to them. And I think it is the same thing that happened here. And as people started fixing up their places and making them beautiful, it became a more attractive town for straight people and gay people to be here.
Yeah.
And I think it's wonderful. One of my favorite stories is when we had a fundraiser at one of two gay boys' house, and one of our politicians locally came and looked around and just loved the house and took his wife to some of these parties. And she remarked that, why is it always the gay houses that are so beautiful? Why can't my house be that beautiful?
That's why you have gay designers.
Yes, right, exactly. So I'm not going to tell you which politician it was, but he's still in office, and it was very fun.
I'm trying to see if Frank Cooper, have you had a chance to?
No.
Well, I put up a little chat. I have applied to the state of Delaware for a historic marker to be placed at Poodle Beach. Because I personally believe that Poodle Beach was a mecca and the only place you could go to the beach other than, there was Provincetown, but for most of us, it was the place that you could be gay on the beach. And it was sort of a haven for decades before it was acceptable to be gay.
Yeah, it's remarkable. There were 4,000 men on the beach most weekends in the 70s and 80s. 4,000.
Right. And there's really nothing, there's no, official recognition of that. And I think that the state of Delaware can be very proud to have hosted that sanctuary. And that's an important part of this Delaware's history. And so I am been on their case, and I hope others will call the marker. If you get in touch with me, I'll forward you the contact information for the woman at the Delaware Historic Markers. And I think, Faye, you would be the one to be able.
All right, I want to write the letter. I'm going to write a letter.
Okay, well, what they need to know, and James, you have the history. I think she's doing the research, but as you haven't written the book yet, it's probably hard to research. And I'm sure that the two of you would be much better at helping her find out what she needs, the information
Let us know.
she needs.
I'm on it. Let us know.
Cool. That would be great.
Were you or anybody else involved in the quote unquote the Poodle Beach riot in 1993, and then became the Poodle Beach 5?
No, I was not. I was.
Okay, well, there's a whole story
that
that fits with the historical marker idea.
Yeah, there's going to be limited information. Those markers don't have, there's.
Yeah.
But
Michael,
the basic reference, the fact that it's been there for.
Well, the reason the Poodle Beach riot is important, not only because it was called a riot, but I won't go into the story because it's a 3-minute story. But as a result of that, the editor of the Whale invited Camp, at that time the executive director Jim Barr, to respond, hoping, at least from Jim Barr's perspective, that he would respond in a way that would be provocative, that would sell even more papers. But in fact, it was a full article that he wrote, but it was very even-handed, and that was one of the very first times that Camp really had the voice, and people heard a approach that was not something that was quote unquote the screaming gays or whatever, but someone that approached things from a much more logical and fair perspective. And so I think that's part of that history of the Poodle Beach.
Michael Decker, you had quite a few comments, but you haven't spoken yet. Can you unmute yourself? Down at the very bottom. Oh, very bottom, unmute yourself. Okay, good. We can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You know, I find it very interesting. My sense, I lived in Dewey Beach in these early years of the boathouse, and I was a good friend of Jimmy Short's at Nomad Village. And it was interesting, the legal sanctions against places like that. And there were times where if they weren't certain of everyone who was at Nomad Village, there was a state law prohibiting on their liquor license. They had a bar license, and so dancing was prohibited. And they had an argument with the boathouse, and everyone here was very excited about the boathouse opening because for the first time, same-sex couples could dance at the boathouse. And Delaware eventually did change that law, but that was a fear. And obviously at that time we had Virginia with laws prohibiting issuing liquor licenses to places where criminals gathered. And they said, by definition, homosexuals engage in criminal activity. And so I thought, I don't know the year that the sodomy laws were repealed in Delaware, but I think there, as a small state, we've been very fortunate to have progressive political movements even before our internal efforts. And I think the repeal of the sodomy law was very important.
Steve was involved with that.
Yes?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm looking it up.
Steve was involved. Steve would go to the Capitol and meet with legislators and all that. He was also involved with the marriage equality. Because as I pointed out, you know, he came from a political background. He came to Washington to work for Bob Strauss, the former chair of the DNC and major, rainmaker. He got a lot of skills. And where was he? He was from Missouri. No, where was he from? He came from St. Louis to DC. I forget where he was from before.
He was from Alabama.
Yeah.
Like Murray, Steve and Murray were both from Alabama.
Georgia, actually, he was from Georgia.
Oh, Georgia.
He was from Georgia. The Delaware repealed
That's
its
what I thought.
sodomy law in 72. 1972.
Was it that? Oh, then I guess it was marriage equality that he worked on.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
this was 72.
I think it's also interesting that from my perspective, and I realized I was living in Dewey Beach at this time, but I thought Dewey Beach was the center of gay life because we walked to Poodle from the south side of Silver Lake rather than going through Rehoboth. And then I lived on Salisbury Street, 3 doors down from the Starboard. And so we would walk on, I forget the name, what they call it in Dewey, but the street parallel to Rehoboth Avenue on the bay side, you'd walk there to go to the boathouse. And there was lots of violence against gays. And Sid and June actually had a number of different people who they hired as lifeguards. I don't know if it was originally, but at some point they had hired lifeguards to be the doormen and protect people. And there were attacks, but they apparently some of the people who were harassing gays there were other lifeguards, and they refused to. They didn't want to fight with their friends, and so that was sort of abandoned. And then for a while they had an all-female force of people. It was called Resort Patrol, and it was a local security agency that had some fierce women protecting things. But I remember being chased and running from the boathouse, leaving there. Cars were damaged. And I remember running the one night, I stayed there till closing. I was by myself leaving at 1:30. I'm walking up the street and rednecks come by and they overturned my car. And the state police, of course, provided the protection there, and I thought they did. They were very, very professional, and I think we were very fortunate because Dewey was not incorporated at that time. But it's sort of a different perspective, I think, of where gay Rehoboth, the locus of gay Rehoboth was.
There's also a informal group. At least they had T-shirts that were being sold, and they wore T-shirts when they were doing some of this, called the Anti-Gay Vigilante Organization. I don't know if anybody recalls those or the T-shirts that they sold. I think they sold the T-shirts out by 5 points at this gas station or something out there.
Wow.
Can somebody talk about one of the darker sides of the boathouse? Did not the owner of that place get convicted of burning down the Renegade? And then the boathouse itself, wasn't there some skullduggery?
We know the Renegade burned down mysteriously, and it was rebuilt.
The first year it was open.
Right.
Yeah.
But then the boathouse burned down mysteriously. So I think at the time, the rumors I remember, they said there was mafia money from different mafia families involved in investing in those two properties. And there's someone here who I wish was online with us today. Is Wayne Hodge, was the manager of the Renegade and still lives in Rehoboth, and he has wonderful stories about things of this time. But the Renegade was originally just a clapboard. I mean, it was like a shed sort of construction, easily burned down, and then when they rebuilt it, it became masonry and it was fireproof.
Right. Actually, the order, there's more than two fires. There's that third fire. You had the boathouse, or the Renegade, which burned down in July of 1980. And then when that was being rebuilt, already there was another nightclub over in Midway called Studio One. And Studio One at the time, when the boathouse was open, was actually a straight disco. Was sort of, the owner said it was modeled after a New York style disco. But the point is that when the boathouse burned down, or excuse me, when the Renegade burned down, then the owner of the Studio One turned that into a gay club, hired away many of the staff and the manager, Lutz, or I forget the guy's name, over there. And then in 1982, in the spring of 1982, is actually when the boathouse burned down. So you had three fires, and in between those three fires, you also had a murder. And so the murder occurred. Two people met up at the Sea Mist Lounge on First and Rehoboth. So all those things, whatever the skullduggery was, as far as I know, there has been never, the fire marshal's office never found a culprit. And they only find like 10% of the people who commit these arson fires anyway. But as far as I know, those examples then were used by the city government, by some of the homophobic commissioners at the time, to say, well, of course we can't have gays on Poodle Beach. Look at what's going on. There's murders, there's arson, there's all these things going on top of everything else that they were accusing gays and lesbians of doing. So anyway, that's what I know. I think I know anyway.
Howard Sear, you had a comment. Would you like to unmute yourself? Howard Sear? Or?
Well, right, yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
The comment goes way back to why people went down past the DuPont houses and went way down in there. And part of the reason was is we could carry beer and other alcoholic snacks and beverages down there, because neither the state police nor the Rehoboth Beach or Dewey Beach police would ever bother coming to that part of the world.
It's still the case.
Okay.
Well, it was outside of Rehoboth limits, wasn't it?
Yes.
Where you're talking?
Yeah, it's unincorporated Sussex County.
Yeah.
And there's really no rules. It's why the dogs and everything are there.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but Mayor Jeff says, please call on Patrick Gossett. He's historic. Patrick, do you want to say anything? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, Patrick, come on.
Yeah, Patrick, we want to hear your stories.
Yeah, we're waiting for you.
What was he? There he is.
Patrick actually
There
stepped
he is.
away a little bit, but we'll be back in a few minutes. So we'll try to connect with you in just a few minutes.
Hi, Howard.
Hi, guys.
So Patrick was what, the third or fourth gay commissioner?
He may have been who was the
Second?
Yeah, he may have been the second. I
I
can't
think
remember.
that's right. I think he was the second.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
can probably confirm that when he gets back.
Yeah, I think he was the second. Howard is also historic too. Howard could talk.
Yes,
Howard talk.
we love
Well,
Howard.
I don't have a historic perspective. A lot of people do, but I was on the board of Camp Rehoboth with Faye and obviously with Stephen Murray. And I mean, it's been quite the development. We all know that. We've all gotten, not all of us, but Frank and others of us have gotten very involved in the political structure in Rehoboth Beach. So we've all played our part.
And it was a good part.
Oh, this has been so interesting, informative. It's been a lot of fun. Someone asked, I can't remember who in the chat, and I didn't want to do it without asking you and Jane. They wanted to know if we could post your contact information.
Sure. For me, you certainly can. And I hope a lot of you talk to James, because your stories are great and we want to get it all down in oral histories. All of it probably can't be in the book, but the oral histories for the museum would be magnificent. And so everyone.
James, would you be willing to put your email address in the chat?
Yeah, I already posted on chat, but go ahead now. You can also post it on the when you get the recording and stuff.
Okay.
Because Faye's exactly right. I would like to also point out that I give people an option. I mean, they can talk about one little specific thing, like for example, Poodle Beach, or they can talk about, you know, a lot larger part of their life. And the reason for doing that is I won't use all that information. Otherwise I'd have a 10,000 page book. But since it's also going not only to the museum here, it also goes to Duke University archives. And a lot of researchers use those materials. And I have a lot of my papers and recordings there. And so what's really important, and I feel this very strongly, since I've been doing this like many other people have been activists for 40 or so years, is that we owe it to a next generation to document our stories. And the best way of documenting those stories is to get them on video or get them on tape. And so you are leaving a legacy, which is important. And even if you say, well, I don't want to have that disclosed when I'm alive, fine. Then we set it up that it stays sealed until you're no longer here. But what's important is our stories. And I think that is the gift that the early gay movement gave us, particularly the Lesbian History Project, et cetera, that our stories are what we have. And so to the degree that you're able to participate, even if you just want to talk about one little thing or you want to talk about your whole life, then please contact either me or Faye and we'll make arrangements.
Okay. Sounds good. Anybody else? Patrick, you just unmuted yourself.
I did. Well, I was kind of in the midst here, and I said somebody had a question or anything that I could answer. I don't know. I've been coming to Rehoboth myself since my mother was bringing me back in the early 60s. So do have quite a very broad memory of Rehoboth on many different types of lifestyles, if you will.
Yeah. And that's, you know, that's the interesting thing is, and I think that's part of James, somewhat you're doing too, is that you're focusing on all of Rehoboth to some extent.
Right.
You know, not just.
I can tell you all the different, well, up until 1999, because that's as far as I've gotten on the Gazette, but I can tell you all the iterations of the parking saga from the 1970s onward, which I'm sure the commissioner is probably has had, and other people have had their fill of. So, and that has nothing, well, except for the little outbreak with the group of MoMA on Olive and on Olive Avenue. It really didn't have anything to do with gays, but I can tell you about it. So yeah.
Oh, Patrick, somebody wanted to ask, were you the second openly gay commissioner
Yes, I believe so. I was initially first time elected in 2004. So yes, I was the second openly gay commissioner elected in Rehoboth Beach.
Yeah, okay. All right, that answers that question. So,
Can I ask a question to
yeah,
people? I'm just curious to see, I mean, we could talk about the national scope in terms of how things have changed over the last 4 years. But I'm just given the people that are here, you have a long history with Rehoboth. And I'm just wondering, particularly, I mean, even in 2010, there were issues and problems dealing with gay businesses, et cetera. I was just wondering over the last decade or a decade and a half, I mean, I assume that everything has not been peachy keen. I mean, the civil rights icon once said, the famous quote about, the universe tends toward progress, but the arc bends toward progress. And I'm just wondering, and even given the local politics here, if it's bending upward in terms of more inclusivity or not.
From my perspective, I certainly think it is. I think it really, it's a feeling about Rehoboth. I don't think there's a true division of straight or gay or anything of that nature. It's just this feeling of small town Rehoboth, is some of us refer to it as Gayberry. It just that sense of pride and sense of warmth that you come back into the city. And I think a lot of it comes from the standpoint of us that are transplants, as we referred to, that if, there's an old saying in Sussex County, if you weren't born here, you're part of the problem. But I think that, the little bubble of Rehoboth, there's so many people that are the quote transplants. You just have a pride and an affection for the community and what it holds, and the pride that we have in it, no matter who you are, you're from, you own or part of Rehoboth, and that's what supersedes everything, I feel.
thank you. I agree with that. I really
Marge,
do. Yes.
Marge, I think when Mark Aguirre was first came to the Board of Commissioners, he and Kathy McGinnis put together an anti-discrimination law for Rehoboth Beach. And I want to say it was 99, 2000, something like that. And it was long before Delaware had an anti-discrimination policy. And it was passed unanimously by the commissioners back then, really early 2000s, I think.
Yeah, I remember that. I didn't know the exact year, but I remember.
Yeah, and I don't, and honestly, between then and now, there really hasn't been, as far as I can recall, any issue before the commissioners that separated the community into straight and gay.
I don't think so either.
Not a single thing. But there, of course, have been quite a few controversies that everyone, straight or gay, lined up on either side of.
Yeah.
But since the Keep Rehoboth a Family Town issue, it really has been very smooth.
And I'm going to say something, and you all may think I'm very naive, and I'm coming from a little bit of a different viewpoint. But when I first came here back in the 70s, there were a lot of, I guess, closeted gays, but we all knew, and there was no big fight about anything. And I'm wondering somewhat if it didn't become more of a divisive issue because of economics, when, I don't know if I can put this the right way, when the gays started coming and we had places like good restaurants, and all of a sudden there was this fear among certain people that the gays were going to take over Rehoboth. So I think I see that, what it was like back in the 70s, or what I saw it as in the 70s, and what it's like now. And I think there's been...
I think that's all goes hand in hand with how gentrification has affected communities, and still does today. In all big cities, that's a big issue. And I think in its own way, as I was saying earlier, that I think that was a threat to
That's
people
what I- that's
besides
what
the
I-
sexuality. It was a different, I think it's brought in a different, a group of higher income people have followed the gays to Rehoboth. And I think a lot of people, that's very threatening to them. And that's and I think we have to understand that.
Yeah.
And if I could say something, I remember just before I left Main Street in 2009, which was after the crash of the housing bubble and all of that. It was pretty tough. And when they were talking about the economics, they credited the gay community in Rehoboth with saving the economy of Rehoboth. My
That's
dog has
probably
gone
true.
crazy.
That's
Yeah.
probably true. So, okay,
We
well,
also have a change in demographics because it's more expensive to live
Yes.
or to come to Rehoboth. There are fewer young people, and I think it has to do with assimilation into just assimilation in general. I've been a longtime college professor, and I found that my gay students wanted to hang out with their straight friends. And I think today there are many, many more young gay people going to a place like Ocean City, and less so to Rehoboth, because they don't feel the same need to be in a nurturing, safe environment that motivated us to come to Rehoboth during our lives. And I wonder how that will change Rehoboth over a period of time, because there's really, I don't see a group of people who are 18 to 40 who are replacing this generation. So there will be a change from that.
And then
I remember when the bar AM opened in Ames.
Right.
The people who started that specifically for the reason that they thought, without the renegade, where is the next generation of young gay people going to come from to continue the traditions of Rehoboth? And so that's been a concern for a long time, and I believe it is an issue. And your perspective on people not segregating younger people, that's what happened in France. I mean, that was the gay bars kind of dissipated in France. There were gay bars, but they were just pickup bars largely, because as it became more socially acceptable, everybody just kind of melded together, and there wasn't a need to ghettoize.
I was just going to point out, if you look at the history of the modern gay movement, going back to Magnus Hirschfeld in the 1890s, 1880s, all the movement itself is a reaction to the incredible problems that gay men and lesbians faced. And if there was not that oppression, then what we would have seen in the gay movement would have been not a movement at all. Because why would people risk their livelihood? Why would people risk their family name to become activists if it was not an issue? And even when you look at the period of time in the 1980s, and I like to give people's feedback on this, but from what I look at Rehoboth in the 1980s, is that you had a town of which understood people were gay. It was by and large no big deal, etc. But as Marge pointed out, once that became visible after the Whale article, and then after the Renegade, and then all of a sudden we had development of AIDS, and then we had the Strand, all those things going on, along with some of the commissioners, the mayor, etc., and the homeowner association, all of which, some of whom are guilty of furthering that demagoguery, is that you had these kinds of reactions. And in the process of that, I also like to point out that there's other groups who are writing quote unquote gay groups, one called the Gay Community Center of Rehoboth in 1988, 87. They wrote several letters to the paper saying, if it wasn't for the Strand, it wasn't for all these gays being noisy and cruising up in the state park and stuff, everything would be fine. So, history is pretty complex. And that's why I asked the question about the future here, because in some ways, when you're talking about Rehoboth being a inclusivity, then in some ways what you're really talking about is the notion of a Baltimore Avenue gay street, like other kinds of gay enclaves, really being a non-issue. That is, there's no such thing as a gay street or gay bars or gay food or something. There's just people who are willing to accept other people despite or without regard to their sexualities.
Very interesting. I think we're going to have to start to close on that one. I think that was an excellent statement. I can't thank you, James and Faye, enough for coming and leading this discussion. And I'm so pleased we had so much input from our audience. As Faye and both Faye and James have put their email on the chat if anybody's interested in contacting them. And I hope you do. And I hope we go forward and maybe we can do this again. So,
Good seeing everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.